Assalamu alaikum. Lecture 2 of Web Design and Development, and this lecture will deal with the web engineering process. It is much similar to the software engineering process we have already studied in multiple. Here are the lecture contents. First of all, we will define formally what web engineering is, and then we will define a process model for web application, and then we will look at the pros and the cons of the process model defined for web applications. Uh, to define the web development or web engineering, we must have to understand the definition of software engineering process. A software engineering is a science and art of building significant software systems that are on time, budget, with correct operations and acceptable performance. So these are some fundamental requirements that you have to follow in your software development model, that your product must be on time, and it must follow the budget constraints, and it must specify the correct operations, and it must have some acceptable performance. So it is much similar to the web application. It is the process to create quality web application by extending the software engineering to web application. So you have to apply all four components to your web application as well to follow a software engineering process to your web applications. However, it depends upon the principles and management activities found in the software engineering processes. So whichever model you use, you have to follow the principles of that and management activities of such models. For example, if you use the waterfall model, you have to follow the principles of the waterfall model, and if you use an iterative model, you have to use those activities. So web application or your development of web application is a systematic and quantifiable approach to cost-effective analysis, design, implementation, testing, operation, maintenance, and of high-quality web application. So it is quite similar to the web engineering, or you can say software engineering process, that it is a systematic and quantifiable approach, that you have a follow a series of steps, and that series of steps can be measurable. uh, you have to apply these steps for a cost effective model. For example, you have to analyze the requirements, and then you have to design those requirements to into a design document, and then implement into some programming language, and then test it to environment and operations in, and maintenance when the application is delivered to the end user for a high quality web application. So it is very much similar to the software engineering process, that you have to be on time, and on you have to follow the costs. It should be on budget and should be high quality. That means it has some acceptable performance, and it must follow some systematic and quantifiable approaches of your software development process model. Further to that, a web application is a system that utilizes W3C. W3C stands for www Consortium. So it is a consortium that provides standards and technologies to deliver web-specific resources to clients, typically through a web browser. So it is typically provided through a web browser, but it is not necessary that you always have to provide web application through browser. You can provide it using any other medium, such as an application from a third party, or a device directly linked with your web application data source. So it is actually a combination of technology and interaction. For example, the old, or you can say obsolete websites that have no software components, such as static HTML pages, are not called web applications or web apps. So you have to integrate technology, and you have to mix it up with some interaction, that your website must be able to have some processing and interaction with the user. So here are some causes of poor design and some causes of project failures or drawbacks. So first of all, the people who consider that web development is easy, this is one of the uh, root causes of poor design. Web development is not as easy, because if you want to develop some high quality product, you have to work hard on the development process. And there is another cause of poor design, that is you follow the techniques that should not be used. For example, you design a page in a application using architecture that is not well suited to web application. For example, if you use a client server architecture where a model view based architecture is required, that will not be successful. On the other hand, where a client server architecture is required and you do not apply that architecture in specific task, then you are also bound to have some poor design. And techniques that should be used or not, similar to above point, that you have to follow the appropriate techniques that are required for the specific application. So these are the results of some survey that lists the top project failures or drawbacks. So number one drawback is failure to meet the business objective. So 84% of projects in web applications show that they fail to meet the business objectives. For example, you start an application to develop some functionality for a university campus management system, and you fail to analyze the actual business objectives. So approximately 84% of all the projects started in any field fail to meet the actual business objectives. So we have to be very careful before starting any application in the web to specify its business objective at the start very clearly. Another cause of failure is the project schedule delays. 79% of the projects usually face schedule delays, so that the projects or applications are delivered late as the time frame. Another problem that web project face is the project overruns, sorry, budget overruns. So approximately 60% of the project face the budget overruns. That means you have exceeded the estimated financial money in the projects, and also 50% of projects lack the functionality. So you have to be very clear on these points when you are developing your own applications. For example, you have to specify the business objectives in the start very clearly, and you have to be very flexible in the specification of project schedules, and you must have some extra money that you can run on the that you want to invest to complete the application. And you must also consider the complete functionality, or you can say the functionality to meet a specified standard. So web engineering solutions are, you have to specify the clear goals. You have to follow a systematic and phased development so that you can overcome the project schedules, and you have to specify careful planning so that budget overruns are minimized, and you have to use the iterative and continuous editing of the entire process so that each of these points must be met well in time and on budget. So for that we need a process model. A process model is a set of related activities that lead to the production of software product. So development of software from scratch, there are two options. For example, you need to develop a new application or you are extending a existing application. So common activities are similar to the other process models such as software specification, then you move to the design and implementation phase, then you validate the design and implementation, and then you implement the software evolution cycle. So software development does not have its own, web development does not have its own mature development process model. So software development models uh, produced by the software engineering field are also applied to the web development, so they are uh, adopted in the web domain. So in the web, it is very important to consider that development time is very short. So you need an immediate delivery mechanism. So process must be feasible enough to implement these major requirements. A process model must be able to handle the changing requirements, because in the web application the requirements often change and sometimes they emerge during the development. So your process model must be able to handle the changing requirements. So it not be a fixed process model such as a waterfall that has the fixed phases and the process is followed in a sequence, so it will be very difficult to manage the changing requirements. So process model must be some kind of iterative or agile method that must handle the changing requirements. So you also have to integrate changes rapidly and remain in the competition. So there must be some iterative or incremental model that allows you to integrate changes in your application and deploy them rapidly to the end user, so that your application is up to the standard. User involvement is more critical, as you must be aware that user must be involved in all phases of your development to handle the changing requirements. Your process model must be able to adapt to web applications complexity level. For example, if you have a very low complexity application, that means you have an application that has very limited functionality and the functionality is quite common, such as a simple application for CRUD operations. So your process must be very lightweight, that you do not have to involve on the activities such as requirement analysis, design, implementation, testing, etc. But if you have a very high complexity application, your process should be a heavyweight process. That means it must involve all the development phases that a software project model should have. So, uh, catering these two needs, we have a process model called a rationally unified process, that is a heavyweight, phase-oriented, incremental, iterative process described in three perspectives. So we have a rational unified process, which is a heavyweight process by default. It has multiple phases, it is incremental, and it follows an iterative process which has three perspectives. The first perspective is the dynamic perspective, which means the phases. So it have a number of phases such as requirement analysis, design, implementation, and testing, etc. But these phases are dynamic, so you can change these phases to the as per the complexity of your application. So if you have a low complexity, you can use very few phases, and if you have a high complexity, you can use the more phases. Then there is a static perspective, which involves the activities in the phases. That means in the each phase there are fixed activities such as the methods to gather the requirements, for example, the use case diagrams, the requirement elicitation processes, and similarly, if we see in the design phase, there are some activities. There are static activities. For example, the use case diagram can also be used in the design process and the class diagram, etc. And it also deals with the practice perspective. That means only the good engineering practices must be followed, which will be see in the next few slides. So rational unified process starts with the inception phase. That means it starts with the definition of business case for the project. The goal of this phase is to develop the business case, and the end project will be a business case. So you have to identify and interact with the external entities such as stakeholders to assess the needs of the business contribution. So when you are done with the inception, you have a business case. Then you elaborate that business case in the next step. This will help you to establish understanding with the problem. The goals of this phase are to establish the software scope. That means what kind of functionality your software will provide. It will discriminate with the critical use cases. That means the major functionality highlighted in the elaboration phase, and it will also estimate the cost, schedules, and the risk involved in the development. So end product will be a development plan that you can specify for the implementation, a use case model, or architectural description that how your components will be divided into the web application. So when you are clear with the elaboration of the problem, you start construction. This is the third phase of your RUP process. It involves the system design, programming, and testing. The goal is to develop and design, implement the design, and validate the system. So when you have the problem clearly formulated, you start coding your application, and you start after the coding, you start testing or validating your application. The end product will be a web application or some training material to use that web application. The final phase should be about the transition. When the application is developed and tested, you have to install the system in the real environment. The goal is the testing in the real environment, that your application actually works in the real environment with the specified performance. So you can also involve the training process in the transition phase, and you can also apply some bug fixing and performance enhancement as per the user requirement. So end product of this phase should be a documented system working correctly in the actual environment. So these are some best practices that you must use in each of your web application project, that you must use an iterative project and iterative process, and you must develop your application iteratively. There must be a mechanism to manage the changing requirements, so you have to follow this process iteratively. If you use an incremental or iterative process, you have the ability to manage the changing requirements. Use the component based architecture is another best practice. If you design your application into the components, it will be very easy to manage the changes in each component. For example, if you require the change in one component and your application supports the component based architecture, you do not have to worry about the other components, and you can change only in the single component that requires the change. Then you have to it is a good practice to visually model the software using any language, modeling language such as a unified modeling language. You must be using these two concepts in your other subject you are studying in this semester, software design and architecture. So it will help you to visually see the components of your system and how each component interacts with each other. So it will be beneficial for you to communicate between your organization or within the team members. It is a good practice to verify the software quality. You have to employ some quality standards to verify the quality of your application, and you also should use a control changes to the software. For example, you should use a version control system, that what requirements are deployed in version 1.0, and what are you going to do in the next version. So you have to control changes to the software in some controlled manner. So these are the common tasks that we follow in the software development uh, activities. Software development process model: requirements, analysis, design, implementation, and test. So these are the phases of rational unified process model. So we started with the inception, elaboration, construction, and transition. So you must be very familiar with these tasks. Requirement and analysis, as you say, these are mostly related in the initial part of your process, and the design and implementation deals with the later part of your unified process model. However, the testing should be applied to the each part so that your application meets the uh, certain quality provided by the some standard. So if you look at the inception phase for the rational unified project process for web problems, the definition is very problematic for very web application, as we have already discussed that the scope or the business requirement identification is a very difficult project problem for the web applications. So you have no concrete view of system at the beginning, so you can use rational unified process for the inception phase, and you can to spend as much time as in the inception phase to define the actual business case for the web application. In the elaboration phase, you can also feel a problem of short development time, because in the iterative or the incremental model, you have to deploy your first version very early. So first version has a priority over the clearly defined end project. So your first version must not meet the end product requirements. This phase allows you to develop fast and deploy very early in the end user environment. So it also allows you to parallel development of different releases. Traditional unified process allow parallel development in construction phase. So you start the inception and the construction phase in the parallel phases. Uh, so once the requirements are clear for the one version, you can start the construction of that version, and you can look for the requirements of next version. In the meantime, when the uh, first version is constructed, the requirement for the second version is not ready, and you can start the construction of second version. If you want to study more about it, you have to go to the summer release software engineering book, and chapter 2 will help you to understand about the software development process models for web applications. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, you can ask me in the question and answer session.